Ethan Caldwell thought he was about to throw a homeless woman off company property. He had no idea that within the next hour, she would expose a flaw that his entire engineering team had failed to find. The morning sun reflected off the steel towers of Raventech Energy Solutions, one of the largest industrial facilities in the state. Warning lights blinked across control panels. Engineers rushed through glass corridors carrying tablets and reports. Every minute the system remained offline was costing the company thousands of dollars. Inside the operations center, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Senior engineers argued over data streams projected across massive screens. Department heads spoke in clipped voices. Coffee cups sat forgotten on desks as alarms flashed silently in the background. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it all. At 48 years old, the chief engineer had built a reputation for solving problems others considered impossible. His tailored navy jacket and polished boots reflected the authority he carried. Yet this morning, frustration was beginning to crack his confidence. The facility's secondary cooling network had failed during the night. Multiple teams had worked for nearly 10 hours without finding the root cause. Millions of dollars in equipment sat idle while executives demanded answers. Outside the security gate, unnoticed by most employees, a woman sat quietly on a weathered bench. Rachel Morgan pulled her worn gray coat tighter against the cool morning breeze. A faded backpack rested beside her. Her sneakers were scuffed. Strands of light brown hair escaped from beneath a knitted cap. To passing workers, she looked like someone life had forgotten. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced at her for only a second before looking away. Rachel seemed used to it. She watched employees enter the facility while sipping coffee from a paper cup. Her expression remained calm, almost detached. Occasionally her eyes drifted toward the towering pipes and cooling structures rising above the complex. Unlike everyone else rushing through the morning, she appeared to be studying them. A security guard stepped outside and immediately frowned when he noticed her still there. Rachel had spent the previous night near the industrial district after the local shelter reached capacity. The bench offered little comfort, but it was dry and relatively quiet. The guard had already asked her to move twice. He started walking toward her again when a sudden burst of activity near the main entrance caught his attention. Several engineers hurried outside carrying blueprints and equipment cases. Their faces were tight with concern. Rachel watched them disappear toward the cooling towers. Something in her eyes shifted. Not fear. Not curiosity. Recognition. She slowly lowered her coffee cup and focused on the facility beyond the fence. The distant hum of generators mixed with the sharp beeping of warning systems. Most people would have heard only noise. Rachel seemed to hear something else entirely. As the morning continued, executives arrived in black SUVs. Engineers gathered around portable monitors. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. No one paid attention to the homeless woman sitting quietly near the gate. No one imagined that the person everyone overlooked would soon become the most important person at Raventech Energy Solutions. And before the day was over, an entire room full of experts would learn a lesson they would never forget. By late morning, the crisis at Raventech had become impossible to ignore. News of the malfunction had spread through every department. Maintenance crews waited for instructions that never seemed to come. Supervisors checked their watches repeatedly. Even employees with no connection to engineering could feel the growing pressure settling over the facility. Inside the operations center, large digital displays showed fluctuating temperatures and unstable pressure readings. Teams had examined valves, sensors, software systems, and backup controls. Every proposed solution led to another dead end. Ethan Caldwell stood near the central console, reviewing reports with visible frustration. He was not accustomed to being stuck. Throughout his career, people had trusted him to have answers. Today, he had none. Outside the fence, Rachel Morgan remained on the bench. The coffee in her paper cup was long gone. She sat quietly watching technicians move between structures that towered above the facility grounds. To anyone passing by, she appeared detached from the world around her. The truth was exactly the opposite. Her eyes tracked details others ignored. A maintenance truck stopped near one section of the cooling network. Two workers climbed out and began inspecting a cluster of pipes. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Seconds later, she glanced toward a distant pressure tower. Something about the pattern bothered her. She stood slowly and walked closer to the perimeter fence. The security guard noticed immediately. "Ma'am, you cannot stay near the gate," he said firmly. Rachel nodded politely and stepped back. "I understand," she replied. Her voice was calm. "I was only looking." The guard sighed. He had expected an argument. Instead, Rachel returned to the bench without complaint. For several minutes she remained silent. Then she looked back toward the facility and quietly shook her head. The guard frowned. "What?" Rachel hesitated. "Nothing." "You looked like you wanted to say something." She stared at the industrial structures beyond the fence. "Those crews are checking the wrong area." The guard blinked. "Excuse me?" Rachel shrugged as though the observation meant nothing. "Never mind." But the words lingered. Nearby, a young engineer named Tyler Brooks emerged from the facility carrying a stack of diagnostic printouts. He had spent nearly 12 exhausting hours helping search for the source of the failure. As he walked past the gate, he overheard the final part of the exchange. "Checking the wrong area?" Tyler asked. Rachel glanced toward him. "Probably." Tyler almost laughed. She looked like someone who had not slept comfortably in months. Yet there was no uncertainty in her tone. "And where should they be looking?" he asked. Rachel studied the facility for a moment before answering. "I would start by questioning assumptions. Everyone keeps focusing on the cooling failure itself. Sometimes the real problem begins somewhere upstream." Tyler stared at her. The response was oddly specific. More surprising was the fact that it sounded exactly like advice one of his engineering professors used to give. Rachel noticed his expression and immediately looked away. "It does not matter," she said softly. "I am sure your team knows more than I do." But as Tyler continued toward the building, he found himself glancing back at the woman on the bench. For the first time that day, a small seed of doubt entered his mind. And sometimes, the smallest doubt is enough to change everything. Tyler Brooks could not stop thinking about the homeless woman outside the gate. As he walked back into the operations center, her words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the real problem begins somewhere upstream. It was the kind of statement an experienced engineer might make during a design review, not something he expected to hear from someone sitting on a public bench with a worn backpack. Inside, the atmosphere had only grown more tense. The facility had now been operating at reduced capacity for nearly half a day. Executives moved in and out of conference rooms. Phone calls came non-stop from corporate headquarters. Every update seemed to bring more pressure and fewer answers. Tyler returned to his workstation and spread the latest diagnostic reports across the desk. Around him, engineers continued focusing on the cooling network. Sensor logs, valve performance, software calibration, pressure data. Everyone was looking at the same problem from slightly different angles. Yet no one seemed any closer to solving it. Tyler hesitated before opening a new system map. He zoomed out further than most of the team had been examining. Instead of looking directly at the failed cooling loop, he traced the flow backward through connected subsystems. A few minutes later, something caught his attention. His eyes narrowed. He checked another report. Then another. The numbers did not make sense. At least not at first. Nearby, Ethan Caldwell noticed Tyler studying a different section of the network. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. Tyler looked up. I am checking upstream inputs. Ethan frowned. Why? Tyler hesitated. Admitting the real reason felt ridiculous. Just trying something different. Ethan folded his arms. We have already examined those sections. Not together, Tyler replied quietly. Ethan looked unconvinced but said nothing. Tyler continued working. 20 minutes later, his pulse began to quicken. Several irregular readings seemed connected. Individually they appeared insignificant. Together they suggested something entirely different. He pulled up historical data from the previous week. The pattern became even clearer. For the first time all day, Tyler felt the possibility of a breakthrough. Meanwhile, outside the facility, Rachel sat beneath the shade of a small tree near the parking area. She watched clouds drift across the sky while employees hurried past without noticing her. A delivery truck rumbled through the entrance. The distant hum of machinery continued in uneven waves. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and looked directly toward one section of the cooling tower. Her expression remained calm, but there was a sadness behind it. It was the look of someone remembering a life that felt very far away. Back inside, Tyler suddenly stood up from his desk. Wait a second, he whispered. He grabbed several reports and hurried toward the main conference room. Ethan saw him approaching and immediately noticed the change in his face. What is it? Tyler placed the documents on the table. Several engineers gathered around. I think we have been chasing the wrong failure. The room grew quiet. Ethan looked down at the reports. Then back at Tyler. Explain. And for the first time that day, the conversation inside Raventech began moving in a direction nobody had expected. The conference room filled within minutes. Engineers, supervisors, and department managers crowded around the large display screens as Tyler Brooks presented his findings. The atmosphere was different now. For the first time all day, there was a trace of hope. Tyler pointed to a series of pressure fluctuations that appeared unrelated at first glance. Then he connected them to a sequence of upstream readings that had been largely ignored throughout the investigation. Several engineers leaned forward. Others exchanged surprised glances. Ethan Caldwell studied the data in silence. The evidence was compelling. More importantly, it explained several inconsistencies that had frustrated the team since dawn. Where did this idea come from? One senior engineer finally asked. Tyler hesitated. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Actually, he said carefully, it started with a conversation outside the gate. Confused expressions spread across the room. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What conversation? Tyler suddenly felt foolish. The explanation sounded ridiculous even to him. There is a woman outside. She mentioned that everyone might be looking in the wrong place. For a moment nobody spoke. Then several people laughed. One engineer shook his head. Another smirked openly. You are telling us that our breakthrough came from a homeless woman sitting outside the facility, someone asked. The room erupted with amused reactions. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Please tell me you are joking. Tyler felt his face grow warm. I am not saying she solved anything. I am just saying her comment made me reconsider the assumptions we were making. More laughter followed. Ethan stepped away from the table. We have world-class engineers in this building, he said. We are not taking technical advice from random people sitting on public benches. Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. Tyler immediately regretted mentioning Rachel at all. Yet despite the ridicule, a small part of him remained unsettled. The data had led them somewhere important. And the conversation with Rachel had started that process. Outside, Rachel remained near the fence, watching workers move between buildings. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. A maintenance crew hurried past carrying equipment. A pair of executives entered the administration building. The entire facility seemed trapped in a state of controlled panic. A security vehicle rolled toward the gate and stopped nearby. The same guard stepped out and approached Rachel once again. This time his expression was less patient. "Ma'am, I need you to move along." Rachel looked up calmly. "Am I causing a problem?" "No. But management would prefer that you not remain here." Rachel nodded. She gathered her backpack and stood. Before leaving, her eyes drifted one last time toward the cooling towers. Her expression tightened slightly. Something was bothering her. The guard noticed. "What is it now?" Rachel hesitated. Then she quietly said, "If they are focusing only on the pressure imbalance, they are still missing part of the problem." The guard stared at her. Rachel adjusted the strap on her backpack. "Never mind." She turned and began walking away from the facility. Unaware that inside the operations center, the engineers were about to discover that even their newest breakthrough did not fully explain what was happening. And when that realization arrived, the person they had laughed at would suddenly become impossible to ignore. Less than 30 minutes after Rachel walked away from the facility, the optimism inside Raventech began to collapse. The engineering team had implemented several adjustments based on Tyler's analysis. At first, the numbers appeared promising. Pressure readings stabilized. Temperature fluctuations decreased. Conversations around the operations center grew more confident. Some employees even began discussing how quickly they could return the system to full capacity. Then the alarms returned. One monitor flashed yellow. Another shifted to red. Within moments, the same instability they had been fighting all day reappeared. The room fell silent. Engineers stared at the screens in disbelief. Tyler checked the incoming data twice. Then a third time. His stomach sank. The pressure imbalance had been real. But it had not been the root cause. It had only been a symptom. Ethan Caldwell slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The realization was obvious. They were back where they started. Perhaps even worse. The facility had now lost nearly an entire day. Executives were demanding answers. Customers were waiting. Corporate headquarters wanted updates every 15 minutes. And despite all the expertise gathered in the building, nobody could explain what was truly happening. Across the room, Tyler found himself remembering Rachel's final words. "If they are focusing only on the pressure imbalance, they are still missing part of the problem." He stared at the screen. The sentence replayed in his mind. Once. Twice. 3 times. Finally he stood up. "She knew," he said quietly. Several heads turned. Ethan looked at him. "What?" Tyler swallowed. "The woman outside. She knew the pressure issue was not the actual failure." A few engineers exchanged uncomfortable looks. The laughter from earlier suddenly felt less amusing. Ethan's expression hardened. "That is impossible." Tyler pointed toward the data. "Then explain how she predicted exactly what happened." Nobody answered. Because nobody could. Ethan walked toward the main display and reviewed the reports again. For the first time all day, uncertainty crept into his voice. "Find the source. Keep searching." But even as he spoke, he knew they were running out of ideas. Meanwhile, Rachel continued walking through the industrial district several blocks away. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade. Trucks rolled past warehouses. Delivery drivers loaded cargo. Workers ended their shifts and headed home. Rachel moved quietly through the crowd, carrying everything she owned in a single backpack. She eventually stopped near a small public park and sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree. From her backpack she removed a folded notebook with worn edges. The cover was faded from years of use. Inside were pages filled with sketches, calculations, diagrams, and technical notes written in neat handwriting. Rachel opened to one particular page and studied it for several moments. The drawing looked remarkably similar to the cooling network at Raventech. Her eyes moved across the diagram. Then she sighed softly and closed the notebook. Some memories were easier to carry than others. Back at the facility, Tyler made a decision. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the exit. Ethan noticed immediately. "Where are you going?" Tyler stopped at the doorway. "To find the only person who seems to know something we do not." The room went quiet. And for the first time that day, nobody laughed. Tyler Brooks found Rachel just before sunset. The small public park sat only a few blocks from the industrial district, tucked between a warehouse complex and a quiet residential street. Most people passed through without noticing it. Rachel sat alone beneath the oak tree, the same worn backpack resting beside her. She appeared completely at peace, as though the crisis consuming an entire engineering facility had nothing to do with her. Tyler slowed as he approached. For a moment he felt strangely nervous. He had spent years studying engineering. He worked alongside some of the most respected professionals in the industry. Yet here he was searching for answers from a woman everyone else had dismissed. Rachel looked up as he stopped near the bench. She seemed neither surprised nor concerned to see him. "They still have not solved it," she said quietly. Tyler blinked. "How did you know?" A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Because if they had solved it, you would not be here." Tyler sat down carefully. For several seconds neither spoke. The evening breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Traffic moved in the distance. Finally Tyler broke the silence. "Who are you?" Rachel looked toward the fading sunlight. "Someone who used to solve problems." Tyler shook his head. "That is not an answer." Rachel remained quiet. Then she asked, "Tell me exactly what happened after the pressure readings stabilized." Tyler explained everything. The temporary improvement. The renewed system instability. The alarms. The failed adjustments. Rachel listened without interrupting. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she processed each detail. When he finished, she nodded once. "That confirms it." Tyler leaned forward. "Confirms what?" Rachel reached into her backpack and removed the worn notebook. She opened several pages filled with technical sketches and calculations. Tyler's eyes widened. The diagrams were detailed. Complex. Professional. Nothing about them matched the image of the homeless woman everyone thought they knew. Rachel turned to a particular page and handed it to him. "Your cooling network is not failing because of pressure imbalance." Tyler stared at the drawing. "Then why?" Rachel pointed to a section of the diagram. "Because the imbalance is being created somewhere else." Tyler studied the page. His breathing slowed. Every line made sense. Every connection was logical. Yet nobody at Raventech had considered this possibility. Rachel continued. "The upstream regulator is compensating for a hidden restriction. The system keeps correcting itself until it reaches a threshold. Then everything destabilizes again." Tyler looked up. "How do you know that?" Rachel hesitated. For the first time all day, uncertainty appeared in her expression. Not uncertainty about the problem. Uncertainty about revealing too much. Finally she spoke. "Because I have seen this exact failure before." Tyler's eyes widened. Rachel closed the notebook. "If I am right, there is one component everyone is overlooking." Tyler immediately stood. "Come with me." Rachel looked surprised. "What?" "Come to Raventech." She shook her head. "That is a bad idea." "Why?" Rachel looked down at her worn coat, her backpack, her weathered shoes. Then she glanced toward the distant facility. Because people there have already decided who I am. Tyler held her gaze. Then maybe it is time they learn they were wrong. Rachel stared at him for several seconds. The evening air grew still. Somewhere in the distance, another alarm sounded faintly across the industrial district. Finally she stood up, picked up her backpack, and took a slow breath. And together they began walking toward the facility where an entire room full of experts was about to face a truth none of them saw coming. Raventech looked very different when Rachel Morgan walked through the front gate. Earlier that day she had been an invisible figure sitting outside the facility. Now every security guard, supervisor, and engineer seemed to notice her. Some stared openly. Others exchanged puzzled looks. A few recognized her as the woman who had been asked to leave only hours earlier. Tyler Brooks led the way through the administrative building and into the operations center. Conversations stopped as soon as they entered. Dozens of eyes shifted toward Rachel. The room immediately grew quiet. Ethan Caldwell stood near the main display wall reviewing another round of failed diagnostics. When he saw Tyler return with the homeless woman beside him, disbelief crossed his face. "You cannot be serious," Ethan said. Tyler remained calm. "Just hear her out." Ethan looked at Rachel from head to toe. The worn coat. The backpack. The tired appearance. Nothing about her matched the image of someone who belonged in a room full of engineers. "This is not a public workshop," Ethan replied. "We are dealing with a highly specialized industrial system." Rachel nodded politely. "I understand." Her calm response only seemed to irritate him more. "Do you?" Ethan asked. "Because my team has spent the entire day analyzing this failure." Rachel glanced at the display screens. Lines of data streamed across the monitors. Technical diagrams filled the walls. She studied everything for only a few seconds. Then she quietly asked, "Have you isolated the upstream regulator response curve?" Several engineers exchanged confused looks. Ethan blinked. "What?" Rachel pointed toward one section of the network map. "The compensation cycle. Have you analyzed its delayed feedback pattern?" The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan folded his arms. "Of course we have." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "Then why are you still focusing on the cooling system?" No one answered immediately. Tyler watched several engineers glance at one another. The question had landed harder than anyone expected. Rachel stepped closer to the display. "May I see the latest diagnostic data?" Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him this was absurd. Yet another part of him remembered that his experts still had no solution. Finally he nodded toward the nearest workstation. Rachel sat down. Her fingers moved confidently across the keyboard. Several engineers looked surprised. She navigated through system logs with remarkable speed. Not searching randomly. Searching with purpose. Screen after screen appeared. Historical records. Sensor trends. Pressure curves. Compensation patterns. Rachel examined each one in silence. The room watched. Minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Even the executives who had been demanding answers earlier seemed frozen in place. Then Rachel stopped. Her eyes focused on a single set of readings. She enlarged the graph. Compared it with another dataset. Then a third. A faint smile appeared on her face. Not a triumphant smile. The smile of someone who had finally confirmed what she already suspected. Rachel stood and pointed toward a specific section of the network. "There." Ethan stared at the screen. "There what?" Rachel looked directly at him. "That is your failure point." Several engineers immediately moved closer. The room fell completely silent. Because for the first time all day, someone was no longer guessing. She knew. Every engineer in the room moved toward the display screen. Rachel Morgan stood quietly beside the workstation while dozens of experts examined the section she had identified. The failure point was buried deep within a subsystem most of the team had treated as stable. It was connected to the regulator network but separated enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Ethan Caldwell leaned closer to the screen. His confidence from earlier had disappeared. In its place was something much rarer. Doubt. Rachel pointed to a series of historical readings. The restriction developed gradually. The system compensated automatically, which masked the problem. Every adjustment you made today treated the symptoms instead of the source. Several engineers immediately began reviewing the data themselves. One after another, their expressions changed. First curiosity. Then surprise. Then disbelief. Tyler watched as senior specialists who had spent years working with the facility suddenly stopped arguing. Nobody was challenging Rachel's explanation because the evidence was sitting directly in front of them. Ethan called for a verification team. Within minutes, technicians were dispatched to inspect the component Rachel had identified. The operations center became eerily quiet as everyone waited. Rachel stepped away from the workstation and remained near the back of the room. She seemed completely uninterested in attention. The same people who had stared at her appearance earlier were now watching her for an entirely different reason. 15 minutes later, a call came through from the field team. One of the supervisors answered. His eyes widened almost immediately. The room held its breath. Confirmed, he said. There is a partial internal obstruction exactly where she said it would be. Silence. Complete silence. It was the kind of silence that only happens when people realize they have witnessed something extraordinary. Ethan slowly lowered his head. Several engineers looked at Rachel. Others stared at the floor. The room that had questioned her presence now had no words at all. The repair process began immediately. As crews implemented the corrective actions, system readings started to stabilize. This time the changes held. Temperatures normalized. Pressure levels returned to expected ranges. Warning indicators disappeared one by one across the display wall. Employees throughout the facility began receiving status updates. Production systems gradually returned to operation. For the first time all day, Raventech was functioning normally. A quiet wave of relief moved through the operations center. Some engineers smiled. Others simply exhaled. Tyler looked toward Rachel. You solved it. Rachel shook her head. The team solved it. Ethan stared at her. No. You solved it. The chief engineer who had dismissed her only hours earlier now sounded almost stunned by what had happened. Yet an even bigger question remained unanswered. One executive finally voiced what everyone else was thinking. How? The room became silent once again. How does someone walk in off the street and identify a failure that an entire engineering department missed? Rachel looked down at the floor. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she opened her backpack and removed the worn notebook. The same notebook Tyler had seen in the park. She placed it gently on the conference table. Ethan opened it. The first page contained advanced engineering calculations. The next contained detailed system designs. Another contained patent sketches and technical development notes. The deeper he looked, the more confused he became. These were not the notes of an amateur. They belonged to someone operating at the highest professional level. Ethan turned another page. Then suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto a name printed beneath an engineering patent application. The color drained from his face. Because he knew that name. And what he had just discovered was about to shock the entire room even more than the solution itself. The room remained frozen as Ethan Caldwell stared at the notebook in his hands. He turned another page. Then another. Patent registrations. Research notes. Technical schematics. Academic publications. Every page revealed a level of expertise that few engineers ever achieve in a lifetime. Finally, Ethan stopped at a document attached near the back. His eyes widened. "This cannot be right," he whispered. Several people leaned closer. Tyler looked over his shoulder. The document contained a photograph taken years earlier. The woman in the picture wore a professional suit and stood beside a prototype cooling system at a major engineering conference. Beneath the photograph was a name. Rachel Morgan. The same woman now standing quietly at the back of the room with a worn coat and a backpack. The room went silent again. But this silence felt different. This was the silence of realization. One executive quickly opened a laptop and searched the name. Within seconds, dozens of results appeared. Industry journals. Conference presentations. Patent awards. Engineering publications. Rachel Morgan had once been considered one of the most innovative mechanical engineers in the country. Her work had influenced industrial systems across multiple states. Several of the patents listed under her name were still being used by major companies. Tyler stared at the screen in disbelief. "You are Rachel Morgan?" Rachel nodded slightly. Nobody knew what to say. The contrast between the woman standing before them and the reputation appearing on the screen felt impossible to reconcile. Ethan slowly closed the notebook. What happened? For the first time all evening, Rachel looked away. Her voice remained calm. Life happened. The room listened. Rachel explained that years earlier she had lost several family members in a series of personal tragedies. Grief led to isolation. Isolation led to losing opportunities. Over time, her professional career disappeared piece by piece. She never blamed anyone. She simply stopped fighting to hold on to the life she once knew. The room listened. Without interruption. There was no self-pity in her words. No bitterness. Only honesty. When she finished, nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. The same man who had questioned her presence only hours earlier now looked genuinely humbled. "I owe you an apology," he said. Rachel shook her head gently. "You do not owe me anything." "Yes, I do." Ethan glanced around the room. "All of us do." Several engineers nodded. Tyler smiled quietly. The transformation in the room was impossible to miss. Earlier they had judged Rachel by her appearance. Now they saw the person they had failed to recognize. One executive offered her a consulting position on the spot. Another suggested helping her reconnect with professional organizations. Others offered assistance in whatever way they could. Rachel listened politely. Then she smiled. "Thank you." It was a simple answer. Genuine. Grateful. But she made no promises. A short time later she picked up her backpack and prepared to leave. The entire room watched as she walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one wanted to diminish the dignity of the moment. As the doors closed behind her, Ethan looked at the engineers gathered around him. The facility was operating normally again. The crisis was over. Yet nobody seemed focused on the repair anymore. Because the most important lesson of the day had nothing to do with machinery. It had everything to do with people. Sometimes brilliance wears a tailored suit. Sometimes it carries a worn backpack. And that night, an entire room of experts learned that a person's worth can never be measured by appearance alone.